Hey guys, Drift0r here. Today I've got a mostly spoiler-free review for you of Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. I'm going to say mostly spoiler-free because in order to do a full proper review, I do need to talk about a few plot points, but I'm not going to be talking about major plot points, nothing that you wouldn't get from watching the trailer or the first 15 or 30 minutes of the movie, so nothing major, shouldn't freak anybody out. The gameplay you're going to be seeing is from the Battle of Jakku on Star Wars Battlefront. That's the new map that they added for free, and it takes place after the Death Star was destroyed in Return of the Jedi. It's considered the turning point or the final battle in the Galactic Civil War, and you'll see the remnants of this battle in the very beginning of The Force Awakens. It's considered the last battle of the war. In a review like this, nostalgia plays a big role, and anytime I'm talking about nostalgia, I would like to talk about the Topps trading card app. If you grew up in the 90s like me and you watched Star Wars like me, you probably had some of these trading cards with the characters, the pictures, a little story, and things like that. You trade with your friends. They're trying to bring this back now in the form of an app, which I have linked, first link up there in the description, and in order to boost this in the younger demographic, they loaded up with a boatload of Episode 7 cards, which actually match up surprisingly well with the original trilogy cards, considering they happen just after each other and after a war, so there's not a tremendous amount of technological development. Looks very similar. They added a trading feature, and now you get free credits just for signing in. Like every day you get free credits to get new cards with. Would like to point it out, very nostalgic, something I play with on occasion. But let's talk about the movies. I'm mostly going to be comparing Episode 7 to the original trilogy because I feel like it was a big throwback to that one, and they tried really hard to capture the magic of that original Star Wars A New Hope. One of the things that I loved about the original trilogy of Star Wars is that each one of them tells a complete story, but each story is a cycle, and it focuses on Luke. It's kind of this age-old story about a boy changing the world, and it goes like this. Episode 1, a boy runs away from home. A boy is bored, he's tired of farming, he doesn't like his life, it's not exciting, he wants to go out and chase adventure, he wants to become bigger, better, find something, and admittedly under duress, he does so. He joins the rebellion, completes his childish fantasies, that sort of thing. This is a common story. In Episode 2, things make a darker turn. He begins to realize that adventures don't always end well, that not everything is happy-go-lucky, that people depend on you, and over the course of this journey, he becomes injured, and a boy becomes a man. That's Empire Strikes Back. Finally, in Return of the Jedi, we're going to complete this cycle with a full-grown man choosing a destiny. He's mastered his Jedi powers, he's actually very powerful, he's making his choices very, very wisely, and in doing so, he's not fulfilling a preset destiny, but he's choosing his own destiny. This kind of thing was very much so missing from the prequels for several reasons, mostly because they are prequels, and to be congruent in the timeline, you already know the destiny of the characters. They're kind of forced toward these decisions arbitrarily, even if it doesn't make sense, and so it's more like, instead of choosing your own destiny, the old ones were about fulfilling a destiny or being fated to do something, and it also had this sort of the scope of it was way too big. We had a galactic senate, we had chancellors, we had trade federations, war, spies in the Jedi, all this kind of complicated stuff, and it couldn't focus just on the individuals. That, I believe, is Episode 7's prime strength, is that it returns to being a story about individuals with a set destiny. Albeit in the older ones, it was mostly about Luke and a little bit about the other people. This one started off a little bit broader. There were two main characters, Rey and Finn, which would be the female and the black guys, most of you would call them from the trailer, and those are the two core characters in it, with several others with their own arcs and stories and doing their own thing. But each one is actually similar to the Luke story, kind of starting an adventure. Both of the main characters in the beginning of the movie, so I'm not spoiling too much, run away from home for different reasons. Finn is a stormtrooper. He was conscripted into being a stormtrooper at birth. He was forced basically into slavery, and he hates it. He hates being forced to kill people. He hates being forced to serve an army he doesn't believe in, and he works very, very hard to escape and find his own destiny. The other character, Rey, was abandoned at birth and has been staying at home forever, waiting on her parents or her family to return, only to realize they're never coming, so she sets out to actually find her family, but both of them have this kind of longing to get away from home and to find a completely different identity. Both of them are trying to find their places in the world, and I feel that is a very strong start for any kind of adventure story. On top of this, and this is a minor spoiler, so you can plug your ears if you want to, at different points in the movie, each one of them is forced to choose, twice, both between their old life and their new life, and they're also forced to choose between safety and friendship, kind of like choosing to be safe or choosing their new friends, and it's a really crux moment, and it works really, really well in this narrative, and I think that's a very good thing for Star Wars, because it's always an adventure story, right? Which we'll get to later, and this kind of thing just, it goes with adventures, it keeps the plot moving. The villain, I feel, is interesting. The villain's name is Kylo Ren. If you've seen toys, you know his name. And he struggles with both light and dark emotions. Our villain actually isn't 100% bad, which is not something we saw in the original trilogy until Darth Vader kind of started doing some unusual things near the very, very end of Return of the Jedi, and it makes him a much more interesting and much more human and convincing villain. I can't talk too much about him without spoilers, but I will be talking about it a little bit in the negative things, but I thought that was really cool. I thought that the new Emperor, so we have a new big bad guy, a new guy with cloak and hood and that sort of thing, called Supreme Leader Snoke. And one of the cool things about him is he only shows up via hologram, but unlike the Emperor's old holograms, which were small or normal or TV size, he only communicates in a gigantic holographic throne room where he appears as probably like a 50-foot tall god that just looms over everyone. It kind of shows an ego inferiority, a kind of desire to lord over people, that he had to build a special room to make his hologram look so much bigger than everybody else because he is the leader and he has to lord over everybody. Little details like that go a long way. And back to the adventure part of it, the story, unlike some of the prequels, is mostly light-hearted. I mean, it picks up and of course gets dramatic and tense near the end, but it really reminds me of the original Star Wars. The original Star Wars was very much so an adventure movie. It was kind of like an Indiana Jones-esque escapade, kind of using the esque word a little bit too much there, and through space, through adventure, shenanigans, Wookiees, whatever, and the scope increasingly got bigger and more narrow. It starts off very vague, boy running away from home. This is the original we're talking about. The scope gets bigger as we learn about the Galactic Civil War, and then it gets more narrow as it becomes what Luke has to do to save everybody, and this one follows a similar structure. We start off with vague beginnings. As they explore the universe around them, the scope gets bigger, and then as choices are made, the consequences cause the scope to shrink in on the main characters, which works really fantastically well as an adventure story. Not too scary for kids, not too depressing. I'm sure it'll get a little bit more so in the other episodes. That was really cool for me. Another big one that I think a lot of you old school movie watchers are going to enjoy is that it had a lot less CGI and editing than the prequels. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of CGI because we're talking about space stuff here. But if you remember the prequel trilogy, every scene was just CGI. Like, they did almost every scene on a green screen. Every monster was CGI. All the fights were CGI. Actors weren't even like on screen with each other when they did their lines. They acted apart from just a blank screen, and they would kind of mesh them in, and they would chop up their words and mold them. And the guy who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ewan McGregor, he actually said that he said lines in the movie that he didn't even say, but they spliced up like 10 different takes to make it sound like he was saying those things. There's a lot less of that kind of nonsense, so it looks better. There's a lot more puppets and a lot more actual sets than you would think or you would expect, so it kind of has a Farscape-esque vibe on the puppetry, and you know, they're very high quality, right? I can tell they're puppets, but honest to goodness, I much prefer looking at puppets than some sort of weird, smooth, impossible CGI monster. And like I said, there's still a good bit of CGI. It's mostly with the spaceships and fights, but it's well done, in my opinion. It's not crappy CGI. It's not CGI that's going to make you cry like in Episode 1 where they have the battle on the fields between the Gungans and the droids, and the fields are perfectly smooth grass. They're actually like glass-like. They're like polished grass. It's like impossible. We don't have any kind of crapola like that. And lastly, they do expand a lot on the mythology of the Star Wars universe, which in my opinion is a very good thing. I can't talk too much about that without spoilers, but now we're moving into the section of bad things about Episode 7. Episode 7 was not perfect. There are some things that are not so great. I still think it's very good overall, but I do have some gripes about it. Number one gripe is that Harrison Ford is just way too old to be doing Han Solo shenanigans. If you haven't heard, if you haven't seen any trailers or anything, Han Solo is back, which I thought would be cool, right? But Harrison Ford is like 77 years old, and he's probably in better shape now than I ever could hope to be at 77, but at the end of the day, he's just too old to be fist fighting and running around shooting people and flying spaceships and stuff. It's kind of like, at some points, it's just awkward and weird looking. It's like Grandpa in space, and Chewie has to save him way too many times, albeit he complains about his age, and he doesn't move as fast, and I know he actually got his leg crushed by a pneumatic door on set, which made him move a lot slower, but it just didn't look right, okay? So now Carrie Fisher, who's Princess Leia, and Mark Hamill, who's Luke Skywalker, also return, but they're seen considerably less than the other two. They seem better used, and not better used within the story is the way I would say it. It sounded like a condom describing them that other way, and their aging is less extreme, right? Harrison Ford, like in the original trilogy, Harrison Ford was older than the guy that played the Emperor, believe it or not. The guy that played the Emperor just had a lot of makeup on, which is why he was able to reprise his original role in the prequel trilogies. Probably one of the better actors in that trilogy, except for Obi-Wan Kenobi. But he's just too old, it's too awkward, it's too strange. There were a few, we'll say, Deus Ex Machina, magical type moments and that work because coincidence in storytelling. Usually this happens, it's like, because the Force willed it, and it manipulated all of these subtle things to cause these people to meet, or in the Lord of the Rings, it's because destiny or magic or elves or whatever. And these type moments rarely make for good storytelling. As I become older, I notice them more and more, and they gripe me a little bit. There were a few of those, but not too many. And as for the villain, because he's human and he has issues and he's interesting, he occasionally comes off as being a bit goofy or sometimes emo instead of actually being threatening. He's a very emotionally disturbed individual, struggling within himself, and sometimes instead of coming off as, let's say, like scary unstable, he comes off as whiny teenager kind of unstable, which is still interesting to think about after the movie, but when you're watching the movie, sometimes it's funny and not scary. It's a little bit strange, so that's kind of bad. And lastly, I think that there were a few too many old trilogy jokes and throwbacks. I mean, Admiral Akbar is back, some of the same puppets are back, they're making jokes about trash compactors, they're talking all this kind of original trilogy nonsense. There were like at least 100 jokes about the original trilogy just kind of jammed in here. Most of them work, some of them are awkward and distracting and kind of take you away from the movie, which I could deal without. And that's my review of the movie. Overall, I think it's a fantastic Star Wars movie. This is easily... God, I'm trying to think about it. It really might be my favorite Star Wars movie. It's right up there with Return of the Jedi and Empire Strikes Back. It's definitely in that clump. It reminds me a good bit of Star Wars Episode 4. I guess it'd be kind of like if Episode 4 and Return of the Jedi had a baby, would be the best way to say it. Very little to do with the prequels, which I think largely is a good thing, because some of the prequels just didn't quite pan out right, guys. Like, can we admit the prequels weren't very good movies? Though they did have their moments. There were some really good moments in the prequels. Guys, that is all for this video review. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you didn't mind the small spoilers. Do check out the Topps trading card link there in the description. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay and everything else. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drift0r out.
Bam! As you command.
Yatukato.